Hey everyone, YouTube Bill. This is Chris with Overclockersclub. We got a couple of cool cases here from Cooler Master. We got the Q300P and the Q300L. They're essentially the same case. We just have some extra stuff bolted on here to the Q300P. So let's see what they look like. I got all the protective plastic off the Q300P here. But you can see, like I said, it's really the same chassis. They're both micro ATX and mini ITX form factor cases. They are fairly small, but it's really the same chassis. The internals are all the same. Q300P here, it comes with two RGB fans in the front. When we get it powered up, you can see them. It comes with one 120 millimeter fan in the rear. It is not an RGB fan. Q300L, it does not come with any fans in the front. You've got provisions to mount them. It doesn't come with any in the front, and it does come with one 120 millimeter fan in the rear, also non-RGB. So we'll look at the L case here in a little more detail, the Q300L. You got these little filter panels here. They've got a decorative sort of a pattern painted on them, and there's a small magnet around the perimeter that makes it stick right on top there, holds it on. So it's kind of a nice little feature. Same thing on the front. And since they're both the same, you can interchange them. It really doesn't matter. Now you can see the front has this mesh or perforated front panel. That's for good airflow. We've got the same thing on the top of this case also. So really, it's all about the airflow. We'll get the side panel off and take a look at it. Now, a lot of cases are using glass, but both of these cases use the same panel. This is actually a smoked plastic. It is not glass, and it has the little rubber isolators here at the corners. But this notch can actually be rotated. So you can see it. This little notch, your I/O panel here can be unscrewed and relocated up to this position or down here, and I'll show that here a little later. But then your panel can also move to fit where your I/O is. And you might ask, well, why would you want to do that? Why does that matter? Well, a cool thing about this, the back fasteners on both of these cases are actually feet. So you can set the case down horizontal like that, and then you may want your I/O panel off to one side or the other, or you can leave it in front. Now again, this is the Q300L. We're looking inside of there. You can see there are no fans, but you can put a couple of 120s or a couple of 140s up there if you like. And then looking at the back of the motherboard tray, or actually looking at the front of the motherboard tray, you can see the cutout there that allows access for from the rear for your CPU cooler. And then we have a couple provisions. Actually, you're able to mount a single 3.5-inch drive or two 2.5-inch drives in here. So you can get two solid-state drives or one traditional spindle drive, as I like to call it. Now down here in the bottom, this is where your power supply would go. We've got a couple of rubber feet here for your power supply to rest on. And with a small case like this, you don't have a whole lot of room for cable management, which is one reason they went a little deeper here on the back. I believe it's 28 millimeters, so you got quite a bit more room there. And you can even mount a 120 fan there in the bottom if you want to pull air up. If I can get it to the side. And we have a mesh filter panel here that pops off. You got these little rubber pieces here that hold it in. You can see how those are shaped. But they pop in these little holes here, sort of hold your bottom filter in there. Now there's not a lot of clearance on the bottom. This is a small case, so we have the little rubber feet at the corners. You don't have the clearance like you have here over on the Q300P. You got quite a bit more room underneath that one. This one almost sits right down on the floor. So now I took the back cover off here. So let me flip this case around. And what you'll see is the back of the motherboard tray. And here's where you can put your single 3.5-inch drive. And then we have our holes over here to mount your solid state drives if you want to put those in. Radiator support, you can go with a 120 millimeter here in the rear. You can go with a couple of 120 millimeter fans on top. There's really no room for radiator. And in the front, you can go with a 120 or a 240 millimeter front radiator. And again, you've got 28 millimeters, some extra depth there for your fan routing. I'm sorry, your cable routing. You're not going to route your fan back there, are you? Anyway, when you put your power supply in there, usually you can stash your cables behind a shroud, which you see in a lot of cases, and this one does not have it, so you're really left with the space back here behind the motherboard tray to stash any cables. So a modular power supply would be very beneficial for this type of case. And it just so happens that Cooler Master happens to make the MWE Gold 750 fully modular power supply. So if you're looking for one, Cooler Master has you covered. Now, as far as case depth for CPU clearance, CPU cooler clearance, I should say, you've got 159 millimeters, and the Master Air MA410M that I was going to use is too tall by about 6 or 7 millimeters, somewhere around there. Too tall, so I'm going to go with the Master Air G100M, this little guy here that we've reviewed on Overclockersclub, so you can check out that link. But that's the cooler we're going to be using for our testing. Here's another close look at the I/O panel. You got a couple of USB 3.0 ports. You got a power switch, headphone, microphone jack, and a tiny little reset button right there. So I got the fasteners out here on the Q300P. Oop. Again, same type of plastic smoked side panel. Definitely cuts down on the weight that you used to see on the side glass panels. Again, this is very, very similar. In fact, it's pretty much identical to the layout of the Q300L case that we just looked at. And there's one of the rear 120 millimeter fans. And the two front fans are sort of tucked away. I'll have to pull that out because it's really hard to see them. So looking at this case again, this chassis is really the same as the Q300L, but this little piece here, I already had this apart once just to show you, but this little vent cover comes off, and then the top, get off here easily. Since it's brand new, sometimes these things are a little stiff. There we go. There we go. So there's the smoked panel there. It's kind of hard to see through it, but hold it up to the light and you can see it's definitely a smoked panel. And looking at the top, it is identical to the Q300L. And the difference is we have this little sort of angled panel, and up in there, there you go, you can see that little socket. That's where your RGB lighting is. So there are actually some LEDs behind this little panel here, and they light up, which we'll see when we power it up. The fans are actually, I already popped this loose too because it was a little stiff, a little hard to get off for the first time. So I just sort of set it on there, but take this off, and there you can see the two RGB 120 millimeter fans. And then this little panel here actually was at the bottom. It also pops out when you take the front cover off. So again, the chassis is shared between the Q300L and the Q300P. Differences really are the Q300P, you get these rubber encased handles for the top. You get the similar type of rubber feet at the bottom that are mounted there at an angle, which helps space the case up at the bottom. You get the front two 120 millimeter RGB fans, and then you get the RGB backlight here behind this little panel. And both cases come with a rear 120 millimeter fan that is non-RGB. The Q300L only has the rear exhaust fan that's included. So I think we can go ahead and start putting this together. One thing here on the back, it is laid out exactly the same. We have a mount here for a 3.5-inch drive. We have space for two solid state drives, the 2.5-inch drives. You got the same 28 millimeters of clearance here for cable routing, cable hiding, and the back of the case again is the same as the Q300L. So now we can start to put this together and do a little bit of testing. Now it's time to start getting everything together for the thermal testing, which means we'll get that G100M all assembled. We'll get the motherboard in the case, and see what it looks like. Now, the Q300P here does have the 2 included front fans, unlike the Q300L. So my guess is we'll see a little better thermals here on this one since we'll be moving more air. And there's the G100M installed on the motherboard. Looks kind of like a big UFO sitting there, and we'll see that even more when we get it all fired up and the lights are on. Now, another quick tip here. When you eat out, you get these little side order containers. This one's from Applebee's, as you can see. I clean them out and reuse them. Keep them off to the side here for all of my hardware miscellaneous pieces so that when I'm doing a build, these things don't roll off the table and mysteriously disappear. So here's the hardware bag opened up. We have our motherboard screws. We have our little standoffs here, which we will need to put in the case using this little tool. It's got a little hex socket there. And what you do is you take these little studs and your motherboard tray. Some cases come with all of the studs in, some do not. So for this particular motherboard, my micro ATX, I will have to put these little studs in to the proper location. And then we'll use this little tool here. And it's got a Phillips screwdriver head there, and we can tighten that down. And then we can put the motherboard in. Of course, you have to put the I/O panel on there. That just pops in. So I got the motherboard in there, no problems. And one thing I noticed when I was putting in the MWE 750 Gold power supply from Cooler Master, it doesn't actually fit flush with the back of the case, which most power supplies do. There's actually a little offset because we have this angle here. There's an offset bracket, and I took these 4 screws out so that I can get the bracket out. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and attach that to the power supply and then put that assembly in there, because getting to these screws here to secure the power supply in the case, that's a little difficult. But if you take the bracket out and attach it separately, it's a lot easier. And there you have it. Power supply is installed. And there is this, what looks strange, this little offset, but actually it's there for a reason, so that the power supply can stay as low as possible and not interfere with the design of the case. So you have this little angle here in the bottom of the chassis. But that makes it a lot easier if you put that bracket on the power supply first. Well, I got the unit powered up. You can see all the beauty of the RGB LEDs there, and the fans there in that little top panel also. And of course, separately, the G100M has its own separate RGB system with this little controller right here. But as far as getting things rolling with the electrical connections, we've got several connections that come with the case. There's this system here which plugs into this little circuitry that's all heat sealed together, and then it has a SATA power socket here. So this supplies power to the RGB system, and that's what gives you all the pretty lights. The fans themselves, though, they run full speed if you want them to. There's a Molex connector here, and it delivers power to the fans, and they just run again there at full speed. If you want, the fans actually, let me find the connectors here. You can unplug the fans. They're 3-pin fans. If you want to plug them directly into the motherboard for fan speed control, you can do that. And then around here, the Molex connector, we also supply power with that up to the RGB system on the G100M. So there's a lot going on here wiring wise. All this stuff needs to be tucked away as best you can, preferably back here behind the motherboard if you can squeeze it in there. So we're doing our thermal testing, and what I see, the multiplier here, we've got it at 43, so that's 4.3 gigahertz. And as we hit the upper limits of the temperature, you'll start to see the CPU will sort of self-throttle, and you'll see the multiplier here drop. You'll see the, there you go, the processor speed starts to drop. in an effort to control temperature. So it's sort of self-regulating, and you'll see it kind of bounce up and down there. But what I notice here, we've got the G100M, which is a fine cooler, but it's a downflow cooler, and the advantages of that being that it pushes air across the motherboard to help keep some of those components cool. But you are at the mercy of the case fans. So if your case fans aren't pushing enough air or moving enough air through the case, then the heat that is being rejected from your CPU cooler here has nowhere to go besides build up inside the case. And I'll get the thermal camera out here and show that a little bit more. So what we're looking at now is the heat that's building up inside the case. And you can see things are getting a little warm in there. And like I said, you're really at the mercy of how well the case fans can move air through the case. And being that this is a very small case, your options for additional case fans, you're kind of limited. And that brings me back to the design of the case. It's an attractive case, but we do have some restricted airflow. If you notice the front here, as nice as that looks, we really don't have a lot of opportunity for those case fans to pull much air in. There's a little vented section down here at the bottom, and it's going to be kind of limited on how much air you can move. Plus the fans are right up against that semi-perf chassis, and you can only move so much air through those holes. And then we're relying on the single rear exhaust fan to really do the work of getting the heat out of the case. Not that this is all a bad thing, because most people don't run their systems at a hard overclock like this all the time. So for a daily driver with a little bit of heat, you're not going to have any problems. So the moral of the story here is, if you use a liquid system, liquid cooling, and you put your radiator, a little 120 millimeter radiator back here, I think your thermals are going to look a lot better. And what do you know, I just happen to have a 120 millimeter Master Liquid ML120L RGB all-in-one cooler from Cooler Master. So let's pop this in here and see if we notice any difference. See if my theory of having a liquid cooled system that is pushing the heat directly out of the case, let's just see if I'm right. So now we've got the Master Liquid ML120L hooked up and running, and you can see the RGB system is synchronized with the case, so the cooler and the case are synchronized together, and that's a nice function, nice feature. But as I suspected, running the liquid cooler, I pulled the side off there so we can get a better look without all the reflection. But as we look at the system here, we can see we're close to 20 degrees cooler running the liquid cooler under a load than we were with the downflow cooler. Not that the downflow cooler is bad, it's just in this particular case where you are dependent on the airflow of the case. Now we're relying on the radiator fan to push the hot air out of the back. So we'll get the thermals on here and take a look at it. So now we can take a look at the case here, and we're still a little warm around the VRM area, which is not surprising since we're running under an overclock. And you can see the heat there at the top of the radiator tank. And then if we look at the back of the case here, we can see there's a fair amount of heat being pushed right out the back of the case. You can actually see where that liquid cool radiator is. It warms up the frame of the case too. But anyway, I think we proved that the liquid cooler is the way to go if you're going to overclock, thrash your system, however you want to say it. But there's definitely something to be said for the liquid cooling in this particular case. Alright, so originally, in my previous test of this G100M, it was tested on a 3770K that was overclocked, and that really cranks out a lot of heat. In this cooler here, again, not really made for any kind of hardcore overclocking. Daily driver, you're going to be fine. And we saw even with this 2600K on this system that it really puts out a lot of heat maybe a little more than this can handle, unless you've got a case that can really move a lot of air through it. In this case here, great design, attractive case, but doesn't really move as much air through it as it probably could if we had a fully vented top panel that was open and a fully vented front. So again, the way to go with this one, if you're going to do some overclocking, is to go with the liquid cooled system, and that 120 millimeter radiator fits quite nicely in there. And then when you sync it up with the other RGB fans that come with the case, 2 front ones come with the case, and of course this rear one here that we took out to make room for the radiator also comes with the case. But it makes for an attractive combination. Also, these handles here and the feet down here at the bottom, there's an Allen head screw right in there that you can remove if you want to take the handles off. You can do that too. And another thing, this I/O panel here can be relocated to the top or the bottom. Earlier I thought it could go to the back, and it's really not set up to do that. You can also, if you like, set the case down, because if you recall, the fasteners that hold the back panel on, focus, actually are little rubber feet, so you can flip the case over 90 degrees, and that really looks nice too. And the way the handles here come out the same way, you've got a nice symmetric appearance to the case. So there's another mode that you can use for this case. So again, we've got the Q300P here, the Q300L. The difference really, the chassis are the same, so the internal layout, internal features are exactly the same between these two cases. Q300P here is a little fancier. You got these nice panels on the top and the front. You do get the 2 RGB fans. You get these handles and the feet on the bottom. Both cases can be rotated flat like this if you want. You can also relocate your I/O panel here to the 3 different positions on the front, and you can actually put it on the back here if you want to take your clear panel, put it on the back. You can put it there too if you like that layout. Price wise, this one here now you can get it for as little as $45 on Amazon. This one here is in the $59 range, so there's about $15 difference, give or take. So really, despite their small size, these cases really have some nice features. You can build a pretty decent system in either one of these cases. Your motherboard sizes are limited to the mini ITX or the micro ATX. If you have a system that generates a lot of heat, or you have a graphics card that dumps a lot of heat into the case, I would recommend probably adding a 120 millimeter fan to the bottom. And if you really like to overclock, I would go with a liquid cooler like this Master Liquid ML 120L. If you don't do any of that, got a standard system, nothing terribly exciting, then you can get by with the Master Air G100M. That would be a good choice also. Or any other air cooler that would fit. Unfortunately, the Master Air MA410M, great cooler, but a little too tall, so you're gonna have to go with something just a little shorter. Anyway, again, $45 for this one, $59 for this one. I think you get a good value, either one of these cases. I like this one. So this is Chris with Overclockers Club. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.